Hi class, this is your instructor, Scholar Huff. We're now in Chapter 56. This is Dynamics of Ecosystems. The Earth is a relatively closed system with respect to chemicals. It is an open system in terms of energy, however, because it receives energy at a visible and near visible wavelengths from the sun and steadily emits thermal energy to outer space in the form of infrared radiation. The organisms and ecosystems interact in complex ways as they participate in the cycling of chemicals and as they capture and expend energy. All organisms, including humans, depend on the specialized abilities of other organisms, plants, algae, animals, fungi, and prokaryotes, to acquire essentials of life. Interactions between species determine how both chemicals and energy move through ecosystems and how communities are structured. An ecosystem includes all the living organisms that live in a particular place, plus the abiotic, non-living environment at that location. So if it helps, I'll go back to this picture. It includes everything here, both those living and non-living components. Ecosystems are intrinsically dynamic in a number of ways, including their processing of matter and energy. We'll start with matter. During the biological processing of matter, the atoms of which it is composed, such as atoms of carbon or oxygen, maintain their integrity even as they are assembled into new compounds, and the compounds are later broken down. The Earth has an essentially fixed number of each of the types of atoms of biological importance, and the atoms are recycled. Each organism assembles its body from atoms that previously were in the soil, the atmosphere, and other parts of the abiotic environment or other organisms. When the organism dies, its atoms are released, unaltered, to be used by other organisms or returned to the abiotic environment. Because of the cycling of the atomic constituents of matter, your body is likely, during your life, to contain a carbon or oxygen atom that was once part of Julius Caesar's body or Cleopatra's. The atoms of various chemical elements are said to move through ecosystems in biogeochemical cycles, a term emphasizing that the cycles of chemical elements do involve not only biological organisms and processes, but also geological abiotic systems and processes. Biogeochemical cycles include processes that occur on many spatial scales, from cellular to planetary, and they also include processes that occur on multiple time scales, from seconds, biochemical reactions, to millennia, weathering of rocks. Biogeochemical cycles usually cross boundaries of ecosystems to some extent, rather than being self-contained within individual ecosystems. For example, one ecosystem might import or export carbon to others. Here we will consider the cycles of some major elements along with the compound water. We'll also present an example of biogeochemical cycles in a forest ecosystem. The carbon cycle is a major constituent of the bodies of organisms. Carbon is a major constituent of the bodies of organisms because carbon atoms help form the framework of all organic compounds. Almost 20% of the weight of the human body is carbon. From the viewpoint of day-to-day dynamics of ecosystems, carbon dioxide is the most significant carbon-containing compound in the abiotic environment of organisms. It makes up 0.03% of the volume of the atmosphere, meaning the atmosphere contains about 750 billion metric tons of carbon. In aquatic ecosystems, CO2 reacts spontaneously with the water to form bicarbonate ions. The basic carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is straightforward, as shown here. In terrestrial ecosystems, plants and other photosynthetic organisms take in CO2 from the atmosphere and use it in photosynthesis to synthesize the carbon-containing organic compounds of which they are composed. This process is sometimes called carbon fixation. Fixation refers to the metabolic reactions that make non-gaseous compounds from gaseous ones. Animals eat photosynthetic organisms to build their own tissues, to make use of the carbon atoms in the organic compounds they ingest. Both the photosynthetic organisms and the animals obtain energy during their lives by breaking down some of the organic compounds available to them through the process of aerobic cellular respiration. When they do this, they produce CO2. Decaying organisms also produce CO2. Carbon atoms return to the form of CO2 are available once more to be used in photosynthesis to synthesize new organic compounds. In aquatic ecosystems, the carbon cycle is fundamentally similar, except that inorganic carbon is present in the water not only as dissolved CO2, but also as bicarbonate ions. Microbes break down organic compounds by anaerobic cellular respiration, and they provide an additional dimension to the global carbon cycle. Methanogens, for example, are microbes that produce methane instead of carbon dioxide. One major source of methane is wetland ecosystems, where methanogens live in the oxygen-free sediments. Methane enters the atmosphere, oxidized to form abiotically to CO2, but CH4 remains isolated from oxygen and can persist for great lengths of time. Another dimension of the global carbon cycle is that over long stretches of time, some parts of the cycle may proceed more rapidly than others. These differences in the rate ordinarily have been relatively minor on a year-to-year basis. In any one year, the amount of CO2 made by breakdown of organic compounds almost matches the amount of CO2 used to synthesize new organic compounds. The water cycle, as shown to you coming up now, is probably the most familiar of all biogeochemical cycles. All life depends on the presence of water. Indeed, the bodies of most organisms consist mainly of water. For example, humans are about 60% water by weight. The amount of water available in an ecosystem is often determined by the nature and abundance of organisms present, as illustrated by the difference between forests and deserts. Each type of biogeochemical cycle has a distinctive feature. A distinctive feature of the water cycle is that water is a compound and not an element, and thus it can be synthesized and broken down. One key part of the water cycle is that liquid water from Earth's surface evaporates into the atmosphere. The change of water from a liquid to a gas requires a considerable addition of thermal energy, explaining why evaporation occurs more rapidly when solar radiation beats down on the surface. Evaporation occurs directly from the surfaces of oceans, lakes, and rivers. In terrestrial ecosystems, however, approximately 90% of the water that reaches the atmosphere passes through plants. Trees, grasses, and other plants take up water from soil via their roots, and then the water evaporates from their leaves and other surfaces through a process called transpiration. Evaporated water exists in the atmosphere as a gas, just like any other atmospheric gas. The water can condense back into liquid form, however, mostly because of cooling of the air, condensation of gaseous water or water vapor into droplets or crystals causes the formation of clouds. And if the droplets or crystals are large enough, they fall to the surface of the earth as precipitation. That's rain or snow. Less obvious than surface water, which we see in rivers and lakes, is groundwater, termed water underground or groundwater. Groundwater occurs in aquifers, which are permeable underground layers of rock, sand, and gravel that are often saturated with water. Groundwater is the most important reservoir of water on land in many parts of the world, representing over 95% of all fresh water in the United States. For example, groundwater consists in two parts. The upper layers of groundwater constitute the water table, which is unconfined in the sense that it flows into streams and is partly accessible to the roots of plants. The lower confined layers of the groundwater are generally out of reach to streams and plants, but can be tapped by wells. Groundwater is recharged by water that percolates downward from above, such as from precipitation. Water in an aquifer flows much more slowly than surface water, anywhere from a few millimeters to a meter or so per day. Water can change in its supply. Water that falls as rain drains away. Deforestation disrupts the local water cycle, and then from such, it changes the entire ecosystem. Tropical deforestation can have severe consequences, as in the Amazon region of Brazil, where rain that used to be absorbed into the soil, eventually returned to the atmosphere by transpiration, now runs off into streams and is lost entirely. The nitrogen cycle is a component of all proteins and nucleic acids, is required in substantial amounts by all organisms. Proteins are 60% nitrogen by weight. In many ecosystems, nitrogen is the chemical element in shortest supply relative to the needs of organisms. A paradox is that the atmosphere is 78% nitrogen by volume. I'll go now to the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is complicated because it involves multiple changes in the chemical form of nitrogen. Certain prokaryotes fix atmospheric nitrogen, converting it to forms such as ammonia and nitrate that plants and algae can use. Other prokaryotes return nitrogen to the atmosphere as nitrogen by breaking down NH3, or nitrogen-containing compounds. Ammonia, a gas, can enter the atmosphere directly from soils. So let's go backwards to nitrogen fixation. So how can nitrogen be in short supply in the atmosphere if the atmosphere is so rich? The answer is that nitrogen in the atmosphere is in its elemental form, molecules of nitrogen gas, and the vast majority of organisms, including all plants and animals, have no way to use nitrogen in this chemical form. For animals, the ultimate source of nitrogen is nitrogen-containing organic compounds synthesized by plants, algae, or microbes. Herbivorous animals, for example, eat plant or algal proteins and use nitrogen-containing amino acids in them to synthesize their own proteins. So the synthesis of nitrogen-containing compounds from N2 is known as nitrogen fixation. The first step in this process is the synthesis of NH3 from N2. Biochemists sometimes use the term nitrogen fixation to refer specifically to this step. After NH3 has been synthesized, other prokaryotic microbes oxidize part of it to form NO3 negative, a process called nitrification. The genera of prokaryotes, certain genera of prokaryotes have the ability to accomplish nitrogen fixation using a system of enzymes known as nitrogenase complex. Most of the microbes are free-living, but on land are found in symbiotic relationships with the roots of legumes, plants of the pea family, Fabaceae, alders, myrtles, and other plants. Additional prokaryotic microbes are able to convert nitrogen into NO3 negative into N2, a process known as denitrification. And ammonia can be subjected to denitrification indirectly by converting the first NO3 negative and then to N2. Now to phosphorus. Phosphorus is required in substantial quantities by all organisms. It occurs in nucleic acids, membrane phospholipids, and other essential compounds such as adenosine triphosphate. Unlike carbon, water, and nitrogen, phosphorus has no significant gaseous form and does not cycle through the atmosphere. In this respect, the phosphorus cycle exemplifies the sorts of cycles also exhibited by calcium, silicon, and other mineral elements. Another feature that greatly simplifies the phosphorus cycle compared to the nitrogen cycle is that phosphorus exists in ecosystems in just a single oxidation state, phosphate, PO4 negative. Plants and algae use free inorganic phosphate in the soil or water for synthesizing their phosphorus-containing organic compounds. Animals then tap the phosphorus in the plant or algal tissue compounds to build their own phosphorus compounds. When organisms die, decay microbes in the process called phosphate remineralization break up the organic compounds in their bodies, releasing phosphorus as inorganic phosphate that plants and algae can again use. The phosphorus cycle includes critical abiotic chemical and physical processes. Free phosphate exists in soil and only in low concentrations because both because it combines with other soil constituents to form insoluble compounds, and because it tends to be washed away by streams and rivers. Weathering of many sorts of rocks releases new phosphate into terrestrial ecosystems, but then rivers carry the phosphate into ocean basins. There is a large one-way flux of phosphate from terrestrial rocks to deep ocean sediments. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. For plants and algae in an ecosystem to grow and to thereby provide food for animals, they need many different chemical elements. The simplest theory is that in any particular ecosystem, one element will be in shortest supply relative to the needs for it by plants and algae. The element is the limiting nutrient, the weak link in the ecosystem. Iron is the limiting nutrient for algal populations in about 1/3 of the world oceans. And these waters, wind-borne soil dust, is often the chief source of iron. The wind brings in iron-rich dust. Algal populations proliferate, provided that the iron is in a usable form. In this way, sandstorms in the Sahara Desert, by increasing the dust in global winds, can increase algal productivity in Pacific waters. The increased productivity resulted from human-caused nutrient supplementation is not always beneficial because it can lead to substantial population growth in some species, which correspond with the detrimental effects on others. Similar phenomena occur in terrestrial ecosystems. In Southern California, chaparral habitats, for example, increased nitrogen decomposition from automobile exhaust benefits nitrogen-loving invasive plant species, which then replace native species. And in Chapter 57, we discuss one example, eutrophication of rivers and streams, which occurs when formerly nitrogen and phosphorus-limited species experience explosive population growth. So this is showing the dust from the Sahara Desert going across the Atlantic Ocean, increasing iron for algae. And I'm not going to review the Hubbard-Brooke experiments, though what I will do is now go to the flow of energy in ecosystems. So energy is never recycled. It exists as heat. Energy exists as motion. It exists in those chemical bonds, and it exists as light. So there are many forms of heat, and living organisms can use many forms of energy, but just not heat. So as a quick review, the first law of thermodynamics. Energy is neither created nor destroyed. It changes forms. The second principle of thermodynamics, or second law of thermodynamics, whenever organisms use chemical bond or light energy, some of it is converted into heat or entropy. So keeping in mind with that, there is also the greenhouse effect, which is that heat that is accumulated here on Earth. And then we're back to trophic levels. So a long time ago in Biology 1, you were introduced to autotrophs and heterotrophs. So autotrophs synthesize the organic compounds of their bodies from inorganic precursors such as CO2, water, and nitrogen, or nitrate, using energy from an abiotic source. Some autotrophs use light as their source of energy, and therefore photoautotrophs. They are photosynthetic. Heterotrophs are organisms that cannot synthesize organic compounds from an inorganic precursor, but instead live by taking in organic compounds that other organisms have made. So they obtain energy they need to live by breaking up organic compounds available to them, thereby liberating chemical bond energy for metabolic use. Animals, fungi, and many microbes are heterotrophs. The first trophic level in an ecosystem, called the primary producers, consists of all autotrophs in the system. The other trophic levels consist of heterotrophs. They're called the consumers. All the heterotrophs that feed directly on the primary producers are placed together in a trophic level called the herbivores. In turn, the heterotrophs that feed on the herbivores, eating them or being parasitic upon them, are collectively termed primary carnivores. And those that feed on the primary carnivores are called secondary carnivores. So you have the first trophic level with the primary producers, the second trophic level with herbivores, the third trophic level with the primary carnivores, and the quaternary trophic level with the secondary carnivores. Advanced studies of ecosystems need to consider that organisms often do not line up in simple linear sequences in terms of what they eat. Some animals, for example, eat both primary producers and other animals. We call such animals omnivores. Similarly, some carnivores eat both herbivores and lower-level carnivores. Nonetheless, the linear sequence of a trophic level is useful for organizing principle for many purposes. We will follow this approach here, but keep in mind that it is a simplification because animal species often eat prey at multiple trophic levels. Ecosystems are more like food webs than food chains. An additional consumer level is the detrivore trophic level. Detrivores differ from consumers in that the other trophic levels in that they feed on the remains of already dead organisms. Detritus is dead organic matter. A subcategory of detrivores is the decomposers, which are mostly microbes and other minute organisms that live on and break up dead organic matter. Productivity. So the productivity of a trophic level is the rate at which the organism in the trophic level collectively synthesize new organic matter or new tissue. Primary productivity is the productivity of the primary producers. An important complexity in analyzing the primary producers is not only do they synthesize new organic matter by photosynthesis, but they also break down some of the organic matter to release energy by means of aerobic cellular respiration. Gross primary productivity is the raw rate at which primary producers synthesize new organic matter, and the net primary productivity is the gross primary productivity less the respiration of the primary producers. And then secondary productivity is the productivity of a heterotrophic level. The fraction of incoming solar radiant energy that primary producers capture is small. Average over the course of a year, something around 1% of the solar energy impinging on forests or oceans is captured. investigators sometimes observe far lower levels, but also see percentages as high as 5% under some conditions. The solar energy is not captured as chemical bond energy through photosynthesis, is immediately converted to heat. So remember that organisms cannot use heat to stay alive. As a result, whenever energy changes from form to become heat, it loses much or all of its usefulness for organisms as a fuel source. What we have seen so far is about 99% of the solar energy impinging on an ecosystem turns to heat because it fails to be used by photosynthesis. Then some of the energy captured by photosynthesis also becomes heat because of respiration by the primary producers. All heterotrophs in an ecosystem must live on the chemical bond energy that is left. So of the chemical bond energy just spoken of, it decreases as energy is passed from trophic level to trophic level. So about half of the chemical bond energy is not assimilated and is egested in feces. About 33% of the ingested energy is used for cellular respiration, and then 17% of the ingested energy is converted into insect biomass. So some is available to the next consumer. So ecologists figure that a rule of thumb is that the amount of chemical bond energy available to a trophic level over time is about 10% of that available energy preceding level over the same period of time. And this shows the blue arrows, represent the flow of energy that enters the ecosystem as light, then passed along as chemical bond energy to successive trophic levels. At each step, energy is diverted, meaning that the chemical bond energy available to each trophic level is less than the available to the preceding trophic level. And the red arrows represent diversions of energy into heat. And then the tan arrows represent diversions of energy into feces and other organic materials useful only to detritivores. Detritivores may be eaten by carnivores. Some of that chemical energy bond energy returns to higher trophic levels. And this shows ecosystem productivity. So the first column of beta shows the average net primary productivity per square meter per year. The second column of data factors in the area covered by the ecosystem type. It is a product of the productivity per square meter per year multiplied by the number of square meters occupied by the ecosystem type worldwide. Note that an ecosystem type that is very productive on a square meter basis may not contribute much to global productivity if it is an uncommon type, such as wetlands. On the other hand, a very widespread ecosystem type, such as open ocean, can contribute greatly to global productivity, even if its productivity per square meter is low. The exponential decline of chemical bond energy in a trophic chain limits the lengths of trophic chains and the number of top carnivores an ecosystem can support. According to our model calculations, if an ecosystem includes secondary carnivores, only about 1,000th of the energy captured by photosynthesis passes all the way through the series of trophic levels to reach these animals as usable chemical bond energy. Tertiary carnivores will receive only 1/10,000th. So this helps explain why no predators subsist solely on eagles or lions. So the decline of the available chemical bond energy also helps explain why the numbers of individual top-level carnivores in an ecosystem tend to be low. The whole trophic level of the top carnivores receives relatively little energy, and yet carnivores tend to be big. They have relatively large individual body sizes and great individual energy needs. Because of these two factors, the population numbers of top predators tends to be small. The longest trophic chains probably occur in oceans. Some tunas and some other top ocean predators probably function as third or fourth level carnivores at times. The challenge of explaining such long trophic chains is obvious, but the solutions are not well understood presently. Excuse me. So this is showing autotrophic plankton, the algae or cyanobacteria, fix the energy from the sun. The herbivores, being animal plankton, feed on them. And then both are consumed by smelt. The smelt are eaten by trout. And this is where it gets amazing. The amount of fish flesh produced per unit time for human consumption is at least 5 times greater if people eat smelt rather than trout. But people typically prefer trout. So the pyramid of energy or pyramid of productivity. Imagine that trophic levels of an ecosystem are represented as boxes stacked on top of each other. Imagine the width of each box is proportional to the productivity of the trophic level it represents. The stack of boxes will always have the shape of a pyramid, and each box is narrower than the one under it because of the inviolable rules of energy flow. A diagram of this sort is called a pyramid of energy or a pyramid of productivity. It is an example of an ecological pyramid. There are several types of ecological pyramids. Pyramid diagrams can be used to represent standing crop biomass, that is, the biomass of all individuals alive at the same time, or the numbers of individuals as well as productivity. In a pyramid of biomass, the width of boxes are drawn to be proportional to the standing crop biomass. Usually trophic levels have relatively low productivity, also have relatively low biomass present at a given time. Thus, pyramids of biomass are usually upright, meaning each box is narrower than the one below it, which is shown there in figure 56.13b. An upright pyramid of biomass is not mandated by fundamental and inviolable rules as an upright pyramid of productivity is. However, in some ecosystems, the pyramid of biomass is inverted, meaning that at least one trophic level has greater biomass than the one below it. The existence of food chains creates the possibility that one species in one trophic level may have effects on more than one trophic level. Primary carnivores, for example, may have effects not only on the animals they eat, but also indirectly on the plants or algae eaten by their prey. This process by which effects exerted at an upper trophic level flow down to influence 2 or more lower trophic levels is a trophic cascade. The effects themselves are called top-down effects. For example, sea otters prey upon crabs that eat roots of pickleweed. Conversely, increases in primary productivity may provide more food not just for herbivores, but also indirectly to carnivores. When an effect flows up through a trophic chain, such as from primary producers to higher trophic levels, it is termed bottom-up effect. So stream enclosures with large carnivore fish have fewer primary carnivores, more herbivorous insects, and a lower level of algae. So this would be an example of that top-down effect. So human removal of carnivores produces top-down effects. Overfishing of cod, 10% of the previous numbers. So the prey of cod have become more abundant because of so many cod being fished. So now on to biodiversity and stability. In Chapter 55, we discuss species richness as the number of species present in a community. Ecologists have long debated the consequences of differences in species richness between communities. One theory is that species-rich communities are more stable, that is, they are more constant in comparison and better able to resist disturbance. This hypothesis has been elegantly studied at the University of Minnesota's Cedar Creek Natural History Area. So the researchers there at Cedar Creek, they monitored 207 small rectangular plots of land. They're about 8 to 16 meters square for 11 years. In each plot, they counted the number of prairie plants and measured the total amount of plant biomass, that is, the mass of all plants on one plot. Over the course of the study, plant species richness was related to community stability. Plots with more species showed less year-to-year variation in biomass. Moreover, in 2 drought years, the decline in biomass was negatively related to species richness. That is, plots with more species were less affected by drought. These findings were subsequently confirmed by an experiment in which plots were seeded with a different number of species, and again, more species-rich plots had greater year-to-year stability in biomass over a 10-year period. Species richness is influenced by ecosystem characteristics. A number of factors are known or hypothesized to affect species richness in a community. In Chapter 55, we discuss some of these, such as the loss of keystone species and moderate physical disturbance. Here we discuss 3 more: primary productivity, habitat heterogeneity, and climatic factors. Ecosystems differ substantially in primary productivity. Some evidence indicates that species richness is related to primary productivity, but the relationship between them is not linear. In a number of cases, ecosystems with intermediate levels of productivity tend to have the greatest number of species. And you can see this at figure 5620A. Spatially heterogeneous abiotic environments are those that consist of many habitat types, such as soil types, for example. These heterogeneous environments can be expected to accommodate more species of plants than spatially homogeneous environments. What's more, the species richness of animals can be expected to reflect the species richness of plant species present. And you can see this in figure 5620B. So the example of this latter effect is seen in this figure here. The number of lizard species at various sites in the American Southwest mirrors the local structural diversity of the plants. The role of climatic factors is more difficult to predict. On one hand, more species might be expected to coexist in a seasonal environment than in a constant one because of the changing climate may favor different species at different times of the year. On the other hand, stable environments are able to support specialized species that would be unable to survive where conditions fluctuate. For instance, the number of mammal species at locations along the west coast of North America is inversely correlated with the number of local temperature variation. With the wider variation, the fewer mammalian species supported the latter line of argument. Tropical regions have the highest diversity, so the species diversity climb, the biogeographic gradient in the number of species correlate with latitude, that latitudinal gradient. And the evolutionary age of the tropical region was one reason. For instance, scientists have frequently proposed that the tropics have more species than temperate regions because the tropics have existed over long, uninterrupted periods of evolutionary time. However, recent work does suggest that the long-term stability of tropical communities has been greatly exaggerated. So it's not really clear, meaning as to why the tropical regions have the highest diversity. So next up, I'll get to that latitudinal gradient. So for many types of organisms there's been a steady increase in species richness from the Arctic to the tropics. This species diversity gradient correlates with latitude has been reported for plants and animals, including birds. And you can see this in figure 5621 before you. So in birds, mammals, and reptiles. So for the better part of the century, ecologists have puzzled over the species diversity gradient from the Arctic to the tropics. The difficulty has not been in forming a reason for the hypothesis of why more species exist in the tropics, but rather in sorting through the reasonable hypotheses that have been proposed. So now I'm on to island biogeography. One of the most reliable patterns in ecology is the observation that larger islands contain more species than smaller islands. In 1967, Robert MacArthur and Edward O. Wilson, which you may have heard of referred to as E.O. Wilson, proposed that this species-area relationship was a result of the effect of geographic area and isolation on the likelihood of species extinction and colonization. So MacArthur and Wilson reasoned that species are constantly being dispersed to islands. So islands have a tendency to accumulate more and more species. At the same time that new species are added, however, other species are lost by extinction. As the number of species on an initially empty island increases, the rate of colonization must decrease as the pool of potentially colonizing species not already present on the island becomes depleted. At the same time, the rate of extinction should increase. The more species on an island, the greater likelihood that any given species will perish. As a result, at some point, the number of extinctions and colonizations should be equal, and the number of species should then remain constant. Every island of a given size then has a characteristic equilibrium number of species that tends to persist through time. The intersection point, shown here in 5622A, though the species composition will change as some species become extinct and new ones colonize. So MacArthur and Wilson's equilibrium model proposes that island species richness is a dynamic equilibrium between colonization and extinction. Both island size and distance from the mainland will affect colonization and extinction. We would expect smaller islands to have higher rates of extinction because their population sizes would, on average, be smaller. This is reflected in a higher curve charting the relationship between the number of species and extinction for smaller islands, seen here in figure 5622B. Also, we would expect fewer colonizers to reach islands that lie farther from the mainland, leading to a lower curve for the relationship between number of species and colonization rate for more distant islands. The equilibrium species richness occurs when two colonization and extinction curves intersect. Changing either curve will lead to a new equilibrium point. Thus, small islands far from the mainland would have the fewest species. Large islands near the mainland would have the most species, shown here again in figure 5622B. The predictions of this simple model bear out well in field data. Asian Pacific bird species exhibit a positive correlation of species richness with island size, but a negative correlation of species richness with distance from source colonists. MacArthur and Wilson's theory is based on an equilibrium occurring between two ecological processes, colonization and extinction. Yet many islands are famous for their adaptive radiations, in which ancestral species give rise to many distant species, each adapted to a different ecological niche. So how does speciation fit into this equilibrium theory? This topic has been the subject of great interest in recent years. It turns out that island area affects not only the extinction rates, but also the rate of speciation. Large islands have more speciations. Why this occurs is not clear, but it's probably affected by two factors. First, the larger island, the greater the chance for a population to become split into two by a river or some sort of barrier, promoting allopatric speciation, which you all should remember from Biology 1. And if you don't, it's okay. Second, large islands tend to be more ecologically varied, providing more niches and thus more opportunities for species to evolve, differences permitting coexistence. Evolutionary diversification also tends to be important on isolated islands for two reasons. First, on islands near a mainland, repeated colonization from the mainland leads to gene flow, which tend to inhibit speciation. And second, more isolated islands simply have fewer colonists, providing more available resources that can be used by newly arisen species. So evolutionary biologists continue to work to refine understanding the relative importance of ecological and evolutionary factors and how they interact to determine species richness on different islands. This has been your instructor, Scholar Ruff, and please prepare well for your test.